Today is a very important day for the German people. Today, they are going to vote for their parliament. And it's a very crucial vote because Germany has been declining in its economic power for the last 3 years. So now a lot of things are on stake. And we are going to talk about the consequences of the current election and will lay out potential risks for the coming government that they potentially have to face. Stay tuned. We are going to continue right after the intro. Hello and welcome to yet another video from Bloomberg Capital. This time it's a special presentation. We have a lot of slides prepared, so without further ado, let's move into the presentation. So at the moment you can see a timeline of prior chancellors of Germany. Many of them were led by the CDU and some of them were led by the SPD. But having a closer look, there were about 5 votes of confidence and 4 of them were held by the SPD. This is the Socialist Party in Germany, and it is very interesting to see that most of the failed governments were led by a chancellor from the SPD. So one raises the question, is the Socialist Party in Germany simply not able to govern the country properly, or is there more behind it?
Well, that is certainly a very interesting observation that I think not a lot of people, even here in Germany, are aware of. But what would you say would be the reason for that? Because that seems quite suspicious.
Well, you could simply shave it off as blatant incompetence by the SPD, as many other people from different parties would say. But we think these guys were really unlucky in very unlucky times, and we have compiled a few things that are very similar to their election periods. So let's get through this. So at first, we had Willy Brandt from also the SPD from 1969 to 1974. And this text is in German, but I'm simply going to highlight the similarities that were happening during that period. And it was simply that Germany was shrinking and we had stagflation, which means that the economy wasn't really growing, it wasn't really falling either, but inflation was really high. So therefore you are stagnating in your economy, but you still have high inflation, which leads to a lot of distress, especially in the working class. Then we move on to Helmut Schmidt. He was chancellor from 1974 until 1982, and this period was more or less covered by a global financial crisis that was simply there because we had a slide in real estate prices and interest rates were going through the roof. Therefore, it was abundantly clear that the whole world is going to turn into more or less an economic downturn, and therefore this period was also simply due to stagnation, lots of unemployment, and of course a declining economy. Moving further to Gerhard Schröder, we basically have the same things, this time with an English source, that the German economy shrunk, the GDP shrunk drastically, and it was most famous for the very high unemployment rates right after the dot-com bubble. The bubble bursted, many companies didn't have any use case, and therefore lots of employees were laid off, and that's why Germany entered its next recession, and therefore Chancellor Schröder was voted out. Olaf Scholz is one other culprit from the SPD, and the economy is very similar to what it used to be 20 years ago, as well as 60 years ago, where we are stagnating in our economic growth, but have high rates of inflation, and therefore we are in a similar time of distress, which usually people connect to the current person in power, and therefore he might get voted out. Actually, that's a very interesting statistic. During periods where you see economic downturns, the elected party usually loses the next election. Therefore, the incumbent party is more likely to lose the next election in recession years rather than the party that is in the opposition. So we can conclude that basically these guys who happen to be the chancellor simply did stuff that didn't work or were carried into something that they didn't really cause, but they did something that really disgruntled the people who they were voting for, and therefore they were voted out because there was no trust or confidence in these chancellors. So essentially, we see a pattern emerge, and this is what we want to discuss with you at the moment, because it happens to be very similar to most of these periods. At many times, it is an external shock, for instance, the COVID 2020 pandemic, where the government has to act in some way, fashion, or form. In 2000, it was the dot-com bust. In the 70s, it was the oil shocks. So you have something that isn't seen. You could call it a black swan. And therefore, the governments have to act, and they have to act with what they always do, with a lot of spending. This spending induces lots of economic growth, and therefore we see huge advances in the economy, and this is also true for most of these periods. For instance, the bull market in 2020 to 2021 was one of the strongest ones, and this was throughout the biggest economies in the world. After some time, due to the big gain and the big advance in the economy, the government then stops this said aid, and therefore monetary stimulation is pulled away too quickly, which leads to a contraction or a short-term rate of change in the money supply, which then sucks out the liquidity from the economy, which was very characteristic for Germany's economy, and therefore Germany stagnated. This then led to some upheaval in the opposition as well as in the working class, which usually led to the vote of confidence. This vote usually is lost, and therefore the government needs to change. Therefore, we have the same pattern emerge here. We think it is highly likely that Olaf Scholz will not win the election. We think Friedrich Merz is going to win this as a chancellor, and then will probably lead a new coalition with the SPD and CDU, because this is one of the most, I would say, comfortable ways to form a coalition. They could also party up with the SPD and the Green Party in Germany, but then they would lose lots of seats in respective ministries, and this is something that they would not opt to do. So therefore, we think that the SPD and CDU is going to form the next big coalition. However, we foresee quite a few challenges in that period where we don't really want to get into why or how these are going to be caused. This is something that we study every day. We research these topics quite a bit, but if we explained every one of these and the respective causes of them, we would still be sitting here until next week, and therefore we want to simply shorten the video a little bit and just give you a small heads up of what we are expecting out of the coming years and what kind of challenges the next party is going to face. First of all, we think that there is going to be a major global economic weakness from the years of 2026, maybe starting in 2027 to about 2029. This is where we see global liquidity even being drawn out more out of the system, and therefore another potential shock to this time the world economy. Secondly, we expect a second wave of inflation coming. As it happened in 2022, this has many factors that we need to take into consideration. However, we think that oil prices are currently basing out. They might find a new low in this coming year. However, after that, they should only know one direction, which is to the upside, and this should stimulate more inflation. And other commodities should also see quite big bull runs coming in the 2027 to 2029 time period, where you should see quite a bit of inflation coming in. We saw recently coffee 5x. We also saw cocoa really get to new all-time highs, breaking out of a 40-year range, and it is simply bonkers what's currently happening in the commodities markets. Additionally, we think there's going to be record high unemployment. And this is due to structural problems in Germany, where the infrastructure is so old right now that processes have become very inefficient. Due to this inefficiency, you will have companies go down, and those so-called zombie companies were still going downhill in 2018. However, due to stimulus and COVID especially, those zombie companies could still remain afloat. But now we think with liquidity going out of the system, there is simply not going to be any good reason for these companies to continue, and they will be squeezed out of the economy. And therefore, we think there's going to be lots of layoffs coming, and this should start in the second half of around next year. Furthermore, with rising prices in commodities, we should also see the rise of bigger military conflicts. Now we have the Ukrainian war and also the conflict in the Middle East. We think these conflicts could even come to a peace agreement. However, this peace agreement should simply lead to a prolonged period where no shots are fired. However, we think this is simply a preparation phase for a next bigger offensive from the perpetrators of this violent events, simply due to commodities being high priced. High commodities mean that it actually is profitable to wage war, and therefore people who are looking to wage war will continue to do so, and this is what we are expecting between 2028 and 2032.
Those were definitely some very interesting insights, but let's take a closer look into some of these things you just mentioned. So, for example, you just said record high unemployment will be something that will be a big challenge for Germany in the coming years. Now, what might be the reason for that? And then one big word comes to mind when thinking about the German economy, and that is uncertainty. Uncertainty about what is actually holding up the German economy anymore. While on one hand, there are still some sectors of the German economy that are still holding together, like for example German company BASF, which are dedicated to Germany and their location in Ludwigshafen. But many other sectors of the German economy are badly hurting, especially the weakening automotive industry. Germany just cannot keep up with the competitors, especially coming out of China and the US. One big problem here in the automotive industry, but in general, in the whole German economy, is a big lack of innovation. The old companies in Germany are simply not willing to invest into new technologies and to take new ideas and bring them to market. And another big problem is that new companies aren't really able to pick up that slack and bring in their own innovation into the market, because there's simply a lack of support for startups in Germany, as their startups are really more hindered in Germany with a huge pile of bureaucracy dropped on them. So, for example, in the US, new companies are often supported with government contracts, while in Germany, for example, these government contracts are exclusively going to older companies with the reasoning that the government has a bigger trust in older established companies to complete their contracts. But which on one hand might have some benefits to it, but on the other hand, it's making it very hard for new startups and smaller companies to really get a footing. Now, another aspect of challenges that are facing Germany currently are potential military conflicts to come. Now, one culprit that Germany has to look towards at the moment is an expansionist Russia to its east. Now, obviously, currently, we have the Ukraine war going on for the past couple of years, which is worrying Europe to a large degree. But the thing is that even if this war comes to an end, which it might potentially do soon, the expansionist Russia under Putin will most likely not stop there, but pursue more expansion into Europe, potentially even going into the Baltic states. And Europe can do little to stand in Russia's way. We can especially see this in the many sanctions that Europeans, but especially Germans, placed on the Russians. Now, actually, currently, the 16th package of sanctions are being put onto Russia, which should heavily damage Russian economy. But what we are seeing in reality is a very, very strong, growing Russian economy, while in the same time, the German economy is actually shrinking. Furthermore, we're seeing the backing that Europe had from the USA is dwindling more and more, especially now under Trump. Europe cannot rely on the US anymore to have its back. As we saw this especially become clear here in the last few days at the Munich Security Conference, where it is made more and more clear that the US might turn from an ally into a potential enemy in future conflicts, where the US might seize any chance they could get to, for example, seize Greenland. But, as was already stated before, we are certainly coming into a time that will be more wrought with conflicts, as we are suspecting that prices of commodities and raw materials will go up in the future, which lead to a higher probability of war, which should lead to bigger and bigger conflicts in the future. But what should or will the German government do from here on out to fight these challenges? To answer that, let's go back to the pattern that we talked about earlier. Now, right now, we find ourselves at the end of the pattern, where we had the vote of confidence, and now we're getting a vote and a change of government. So now we will most likely see a return to the start of this pattern. So we will see the external shock, which is the manifestation of these challenges, which will then lead to the government acting with big spending to stimulate the economy. Now, this spending will primarily go to companies that will ensure the line with other goals of the German government. So, for example, we will see huge spending on defense, which will lead to big profits in companies like Rheinmetall or ThyssenKrupp. Or we also recently saw a big stimulus for the company Infineon to build a huge semiconductor factory in Dresden, which should ensure more independence from both China and the US. So in total, we should see that after this election, we might get a short period of uncertainty where the government is still trying to get a coalition together. But after the new government is sworn in, we should see them start to act, which should lead to big rises in the German economy and a lot of money flowing in.
But this doesn't go to say that this rise in the German economy is going to last long, as we foresee a larger economic crisis coming to the whole world in the coming years. And therefore, we should see some good times ahead, like the next 1.5 to 2 years. But after that, we should see another external shock that should give Friedrich Merz a bigger challenge to face. We are going to cover all of these happenings along the way. And if you like to receive more of such content, especially highlighting the potential shocks that could occur and how to prepare for them and also benefit in your own portfolio from these, you should leave a like and a subscribe to us and share this video. We thank you for your attention, and until next time, again with Bloombridge Capital.
Bloombridge Capital.